paints a very alarming picture of the pattern of racial violence that occurs here in Stoke. First off, I'll just explain who's going to speak and stuff. We've got Alderman Holmes here, who's the lead City Councillor and the lead for Equality and Diversity. And she'll speak for a few minutes, and then we'll move on to the rest of the speakers. We'll pass over to Alderman.
Thank you. I've been introduced. Hello and welcome. My name is Alderman Hamer and I'm the Cabinet Member, Lead for Equality and Diversity at Stoke City Council, as well as a member and former chair of North Staffordshire Campaign Against Racism and Fascism. I would like to thank norscarf for organising this meeting to discuss the report, New Geographies of Racism. I welcome Dr. John Burnett, who is the author of this report, and the other contributors tonight, and all of you. As a member of norscarf, I am acutely aware of all the work that you, Challenge North Staffs, as well as other organisations are now and have been involved with over many years in combating racism in North Staffordshire. It is because of this work that I feel it is important to contextualise our debate tonight in a manner which recognises and gives credit to this work and to the people of Stoke-on-Trent who have made Stoke-on-Trent today a city that is not blighted by racial violence. The report which will be discussed tonight is both welcome and important in its context. It gives a picture of the past which is important, dating back to 2001. The City Council takes hate crime very seriously. This is why we are supporting Challenge North Staffs, a hate crime partnership covering North Staffordshire, with the aim of providing support to victims of hate crime, as well as supporting partners to change attitudes and beliefs and to support victims. Racism, historically, has strong links with deprivation, child poverty and poor housing. As a Labour councillor and campaigner against racism, I am acutely aware of the social context which can contribute to racism. This is why I am proud that as a council we are tackling racism on many levels. The BNP, which is mentioned in the report, again because our collective efforts are not in power. We are not and never will be controlled by the far right in Stoke-on-Trent. And recently, as you know, a member of the BNP was successfully prosecuted for his role in inciting racism. And I'd like to give credit to Joy Garner for her involvement in making sure that happened. The people of Stoke-on-Trent sent a clear message at the last election. They have put their faith in us, not the BNP. We did respond to racism in our city, and we will continue, with your help, to respond. Indeed, the report we will discuss tonight recognises this and the significant work we are all doing. I welcome the report, New Geographies of Racism, and its contribution to open debate. Thank you. We'll now pass over to Dr. John Burnett of the Institute of Race Relations to present his findings.
Thank you. I was thinking about how to start this tonight, and I think the best starting point is to look at why Stoke and what this report came from. And I want to make clear from the outset that the point of the report was never to demonise Stoke. It was never to demonise the city of Stoke as a racist city. It was never to demonise the people of Stoke as inherently racist. It was never to say that Stoke is a more or less racist city than other cities. And I think it's important to say that, firstly, on its own terms. But secondly, I say that to make a broader point, and that what the report came from was an awareness that racism throughout the UK is changing. So racism doesn't stay still. We know that the racism of today is different from the racism of the 50s or the 60s, for example. And what this report came from was a piece of work that the Institute did a few years ago, analysing racist attacks across the UK, a report called Racial Violence, the Buried Issue. And what this suggested was that the parameters of racism are changing. They're changing in terms of the scope, so with new victims, new targets. They're changing in terms of the state's response to racial violence. They're changing in terms of the political context to racism. They're changing in terms of their geographies. And in a sense, I don't think this is anything new to anyone else. But if we're to accept that, then we need to understand what's behind these changes. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about tonight in relation to the city. Now, I don't think there's ever been a time in the UK when there's been as much rhetorical commitment to hate racism as there is now. So when you think of the sentencing of two of Stephen Lawrence's killers earlier this year, this was celebrated almost as a kind of shared national victory. It was shared by the majority of the mainstream press, it was shared by a whole range of senior political figures, and crucially it was shared by the same criminal justice agencies that so catastrophically failed in 1993. But at the same time, what I'd argue is that as much as successive governments have claimed to stamp out racism in its most crude and raw forms, we need to question how much the changing patterns of racism draws from government policies and practices. Let me give you an example of that. An example which people there are no doubt familiar with, the war on asylum. And I say the word war on purpose. I think that's what it's called. I know people here are already aware of this, but look at the measures taken to deal with asylum seekers over the last decade or so. So they've been imprisoned in parallel detention at a rate unprecedented ever in history. To give you a statistic with that, in 1992, 5,000 people were detained. In 2010, 28,000 people were detained. What else? The right to work has been removed. As much healthcare as ministers have been able to get away with has been removed. Hundreds of thousands of people have been forced into complete and utter destitution as a matter of policy, not as a matter of accident. Attempts have been made to take children from the parents, dorm rates have been up to thousands a year, legal aid has been pretty much ripped to shreds, the list goes on and on and on. And it stems from a framework that openly defines asylum seekers as bogus, I use the word in inverted commas, until proven otherwise, as potential thieves, as potential scroungers, and the media's followed suit, with asylum seekers described as leeches, the metaphor, quite literally, obviously means sort of human blood, as human sewage, as waste, as garbage, these are all quotes. And the reason I say this is because when a group of people are vilified like that and dispersed into the most run-down areas of cities across the UK, they find it's a big part of the reason why the welfare state is being ripped apart, or the reason why poor people are remaining poor. And it can't be any surprise, I don't think. It can't be any surprise at all when asylum seekers start getting attacked, start getting hounded out of homes. A colleague of mine documented the deaths of 77 asylum seekers between 2006 and 2010. These included people who died with no health care, they included people who died in detention centres, people who committed suicide through fear of deportation, and they included people in racist attacks. And so, how does this relate to Stoke? I think it relates directly to the children of asylum seekers who dropped out of school as a result of a campaign of racist abuse. After dispersal policies were introduced, and the school's assistant head said there was a hostile reception from just about everyone, fueled by the local paper. It relates to the petition signed by people around the same time saying asylum seekers weren't welcome. It relates to the man who was advised to leave the home by the Home Office, advised to leave the city soon after arriving because the threat of violence was so real. And it relates to the independent councillor who later defected to the BNP, who described asylum seekers as foreign parasite. Sorry, I'm not making dramatic calls then, actually, I really need to agree. And I think that's important. I think that last point is important. And I think the reason it's important is this, is when mainstream politics veer towards the right, especially in relation to issues around race, then the beneficiaries are always going to be the far right. And I think that has resonance in the context of the city. And I know that there's people in this room here that know more about the far right in the city than I do. I'm very well aware of that. There are people who here have been very, very actively involved in campaigns against the far right in the city. But it seems to me that a big part, not the only part, but a big part, with the reason that the BNP was able to gain the influence that it did, at the time that it did in this city, was by exploiting the wider national racism that took hold. On the one hand, a racism against asylum seekers, and on the other, a widespread racism against Muslims. And I'm not just saying this for its own sake, I'm saying it because over the last decade or so we've got to a point where I think far-right groups are wearing, in some contexts, the same clothes as mainstream, some aspects of mainstream politics. And all this does is legitimise the message of the far-right. Look at the attack on multiculturalism, which has been ramped up as a result of the war on terror. This has led to renewed calls for national identity, it's this that has led to core values, it's this that has led to an attack on multiculturalism, especially under the guise of the war on terror, has become a coded attack on Islam in the UK. This is the current Prime Minister's words about multiculturalism. Under the doctrine of state multiculturalism, we've encouraged different cultures to live separate lives apart from each other and apart from the mainstream. We've failed to provide a vision of society to which they feel they want to belong. We've tolerated these segregated communities behaving in ways that run completely counter to our values. It's a well-known quote. And I'm not saying that critiquing multiculturalism necessarily equates to extreme right, per se, of course it doesn't. But what I'm saying is that the attack on multiculturalism in its current guise assumes there needs to be a set of core values which bind citizens together, and these core values have been eroded by immigration and diversity, and in particular Islam. And this is a boon to the far right. Of course it's a boon to the far right. It's a boon to the BNP in this city, for example, when it tries to launch a national anti-Muslim campaign a few years ago. And in that sense, we've got to question the point of where racism and far-right politics are starting from the same place. And there has been serious racism against Muslims in this city. I think the taxi firms which were forced to suspend the services before the EGL march in 2010 because of very serious threats. I think the attempts to blow up a mosque in a very sort of high-profile example, which far-right groups have been campaigning against. Now, what I think this report does do is, in some senses, it challenges a narrative that the far-right got such support in Stoke solely as a result of the vacuum left by the neglect of mainstream politics. This is a narrative which argues that the BNP emerged by exploiting the disillusionment of white voters, but were defeated when mainstream political parties saw the mistake and parachuted back in. And while, of course, there's elements of truth in this, of course there are. While, of course, there's an element of truth, a certain element of truth in the fact that people have very good reason to feel aggrieved and disillusioned by mainstream politics, this is a narrative which I think sort of lets mainstream politics off the hook to a certain extent. And it lets mainstream politics off the hook by not asking the extent to which policies and practices have created conditions for racism. Now, like a lot of other post-industrial cities, much of this is played out, I think, in the context of the nighttime economy. I'm aware that I can't tell people here about the impact of deindustrialisation in Stoke, and I'm aware that people know more than I do about the huge inequalities that were caused as a result of economic decisions which, in a sense, rip the heart out of the city. But like a lot of other industrial cities, what has emerged in the wake of that industrial collapse, to some extent, is a burgeoning nighttime economy, and all of the subsidiary industries that go with it, so taxi firms, takeaways, off-licences and so on. And I certainly don't think Stoke is alone in this, but it's in such industries where racism in its rawest form can often be seen. And there's several reasons for this. People work in conditions where they're isolated, they're not protected, the nature of their work makes them vulnerable to alcohol, fuel attacks. But the outcomes of this can be seen in hospital rooms up and down the country. And I just want to list the attacks here. But in Stoke over the last few years, a few examples have been fairly widely reported. There's members of a Turkish takeaway who were subjected to a series of racist attacks. One man was stabbed, a man that was in an Indian takeaway was left with serious head injuries, masonry was smashed over his head. The list goes on. Now, I'm not going to say much more, I think I've spoken really up to what I should be saying. But I just want to end by returning to the far right. As I said, there's people here that know a lot more about the far right in this city than I do. But I do know this. History surely tells us that the threat of the far right in general cannot ever be fought by ceding to its demands. But this, to a certain extent, we have to ask how much of this has happened in the first decade of the 21st century, particularly with regard to immigration and asylum, issues around the war on terror. And it seems that policymakers, a series of politicians and policymakers have claimed that progressively tougher measures, if these were taken, then this would lead people to become would stop people becoming disillusioned and turn into the far-right for answers. And I think the opposite has happened. It seems to me that the more that politicians have been happy to make political capital out of attacking asylum, out of attacking immigration, out of attacking multiculturalism, we've been blinded to the fact that a political culture of racism leads to a popular culture of racism. And the reason I said that is this, and this is my last point now. The city owes a lot of debt, I think. It owes a lot to some of the people here tonight, people who fought for years, for decades against the extreme right. People who face a sort of very real threat, physical threat in doing so. But I'm sure that people here would agree that racism and fascism are not unconnected. They stem from the same source. Getting rid of the latter doesn't necessarily get rid of the former. And the conditions for ongoing racism, they do remain. They remain in the way that the polarised inequalities that exist are set to be made a lot worse by a government which seems bent on making people pay for a financial crisis not their own making. They're there in the way that the far right are reorganising across the UK, not just in Stoke, adopting the language of institutional racism and claiming that the real victims of racism are white people, claiming that they're the authentic voices of white people and manipulating more often class concerns into race concerns. And they're there in the way that much of mainstream politics seems quite happy to drum up support by attacking race. And I hope that these are some of the things that we can talk about tonight. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Dr. Bennett for seeing that. Now, you mentioned the non-fighting anti-fascist movement in the city, and one of the key components of that is always, and probably always will be, the trade union movement. So based on that, I will now pass over to Jason Young. He's the Secretary of Northcarf's Trade Union Council.
Good evening. As Gary has said, I'm the President of the Northcarf's Trade Union Council, but also I'm here with another hat on as well, which is the Secretary of Norscarf. I welcome many of John's comments. I'm not going to answer them or refer to them in my contributions. I think there are many people out there who will want to come in. I think what I need to do really is talk a bit more about Norscarf and its role in the city and the role of the trade unions in supporting that. Norscarf was originally set up in the mid-1970s as a response to the growth of the National Front in this area, who began standing candidates in council elections. And Norscarf was quite successful at the time, over a period of 3 years, in effectively defeating the National Front, and their sort of election strategy in Stoke-on-Trent proved to be fairly short-lived. However, we recognise, as John himself has just commented, that you can get rid of the fascists from public view, but the racism, the endemic racism, is still there. And at the time we felt it was necessary to take further steps in order to help to beat the scourge of racism in this city. And we proposed the formation of what was then known as a Community Relations Council. And we campaigned for that, and I have to say we met some opposition at first from the council direction, but we persevered, we succeeded, we got a Community Relations Council established. That organisation continued until a few years ago, latterly known as the Racial Equality Council, but it is sadly defunct, but I'm going to come back to that in a moment. The British National Party first established themselves in Stoke-on-Trent in 1986, but in terms of a serious electoral challenge, that didn't really emerge until the turn of the century. And when in 2001, one particular local fascist, Steve Batkin, was starting to win substantial support when he stood for election, both in the City Council and the parliamentary election. The trade union movement in the city, the Trades Council, recognised that it was necessary to effectively kick-start the campaign against the fascists, and Norscarf was relaunched in 2001 and subsequently campaigned against Steve Batkin's attempt to win the mayor's position in this city. As you remember, we had an elected mayor for a few years, and in the first mayoral election, Steve Batkin, very frighteningly, came very close to winning. He came very close to actually getting into the second round of voting. And that was a wake-up call, I think, for many people who hadn't realised that the fascists and the fascist movement were getting such support in this city. Now, from that point onwards, of course, for the last decade, we have campaigned against the BNP, who at one point actually had 9 councillors sitting in this council chamber. But with perseverance, we effectively, in 2011, last year, the BNP failed to win a single council seat, and so they are no longer part of our city council system. Unfortunately, in education, we still have, unfortunately, some BNP school governors, because at the time when they were in position in the council, they nominated people as school governors. So unfortunately, until their terms of office ends, we still have a few BNP school governors. And I have to say, being on one of the governing bodies that has a BNP governor, they try to exercise a corrosive influence on the school's policy, and when they go, it'll be good riddance to them. But although we defeated the BNP in 2011, of course, as John Burnett's quite rightly commented, the sort of background context, the racism, not just the racial assaults which he talks about, but also the more casual racism, the sort of racial remarks, the racial abuse and so on, still remains a feature of many parts of this city. And of course, we're not out, as John quite rightly says, we're not out to demonise Stoke-on-Trent as a racist city. The majority of the people in this city are not racist. That's absolutely true. But at the same time, it has to be said that many members of the ethnic minority communities in this city find this sort of racism as part of their everyday lives. As John has already pointed out, people who work particularly in the nighttime economy, the takeaways and taxi drivers face this all the time. Just looking through the Evening Sentinel over the last couple of weeks, there have been stories about unprovoked attacks on taxi drivers, unprovoked attacks on takeaway workers. This sort of thing is still going on. Now, also looking through the Sentinel this week, or not this week, in the last few weeks, we actually find another somewhat worrying statement. And it's this, that Staffordshire Police, this year, between April and August, recorded 590 hate crimes, which is an increase of 58% from the same period last year. And if you look at Stoke-on-Trent itself, in that period, 244 of those hate crimes actually took place within this city, and 210 of those were linked to race. The others were disability hate crimes, homophobic crimes and so on. So these figures were actually revealed at a recent meeting of the Staffordshire Police Authority, and members of the police authority called on the force to focus its efforts on victim support. Now, Staffordshire Police said that the increases in reported hate crime follow a campaign to persuade more people to come forward to report hate crimes. Chief Constable saying this, James Sawyers, the number of hate crimes reported to us is increasing, but we still believe that too many hate crimes and incidents go unreported. So in other words, we have already seen an increase this year, a worrying increase. And part of that may be due to the increased sort of campaign to persuade people to report these incidents, but they still represent the tip of an iceberg where many incidents, especially the sort of low-level racism that people encounter in their daily lives, go unreported. And the whole point is, if they go unreported, of course, those responsible are never challenged and carry on doing it. And the whole point is we have to put a stop to this. So, the police have indicated that they are taking hate crimes, and this is their own words, with the utmost seriousness. Now, in this context, I think it is very unfortunate this city no longer has a racial equality council. And what I would call for at this meeting is for the city council to think about very seriously establishing what is now known as an equalities council and applying to the Home Office for the necessary support and funding to do so. The City Council's mandate for change, one of the points is to make Stoke-on-Trent a great city to live and work in. We need to make it a great city for everyone to live and work in, including those who are the victims of these sorts of crimes and abuse. And in that context, norscarf is calling on the council, and we will put the framework in as norscarf, we will support this, but we're calling on the council to support the re-establishment of an Equalities Council